Welcome to Religion Wise, the podcast where we feature educators, researchers, and other professionals discussing topics on religion and their relevance to the public conversation. My name is Chip Gruen. I'm the director of the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding at Muhlenberg College, and I will be the host for this podcast. In this, Season 2 of Religion Wise, we will continue to consider a broad variety of religious and cultural beliefs and practices, and try to understand their place in the contemporary conversation. If you like what you hear, I encourage you to explore the 12 episodes from Season 1 that are available in your favorite podcast app. Also, we would love to hear from you with your questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes. To reach us, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you will find our contact information and also have the opportunity to support this podcast and the work of the Institute. In today's conversation, I interview Chris Borick, the director of the Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion. Since 2001, the Institute of Public Opinion measures the public's view on electoral and public policy issues with a concentration on environmental and health matters. The reason I wanted to talk to Dr. Borick today was to try to get a handle on how the social sciences, and in particular polling, think about religious identity, religious community, and how that might influence both public policy and elections. Perhaps it's an occupational hazard on my part, but sometimes when I'm watching coverage, whether it be on one of the news stations or reading the newspaper, I am often shocked by the inadequacy of the treatment of religion when thinking about these issues. It's my perception, and I'm sure that you've picked up on this in some of the previous conversations, that because the majority of the people in the world are motivated in one way or another, in some capacity or another, by their own religious identity or at least their own worldview, it makes sense that we think about those things seriously when we imagine how they're acting in their private lives, but also in their capacity as citizens. So with that being said, I'm super excited to have this conversation with Dr. Borick. Chris Borick, professor of political science and director of Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion. Welcome to Religion Wise.
Hey, thank you so much, Chip. It's an absolute pleasure.
So it seems to me that we can divide polling into a couple of different categories. First, the polling that gets the most attention, approval, disapproval of political figures, polling of registered or likely voters ahead of primary and general elections. The second category is less driven by election cycles, concentrating instead on the popularity of ideas and policies, which offer us some insight maybe into individuals and community identities, affiliations, demographics, those sorts of things. Does that seem about right to you? Is that division real in the field?
Yeah, it's very real, Chip. When we think about polling, the polls you mentioned first, the electoral politics polls, the horse race polls, the approval ratings, those types of polls are often the most cited. People love to keep score of elections. They like to have an idea of where races are. So they really have a high appetite for those kind, including the press, right? So those are some of the polls that do get the most attention. But a majority of polls, if you look at kind of the universe of public opinion research, are not electoral polls. They might look at policy issues, beliefs, attitudes, perceptions of society. And those, to be honest with you, are my favorite polls. Those are the ones I like to do the most. In some ways, they're easier. For example, electoral polls often look at trying to hit a likely voter audience that changes and is moving and evolving. And so it's really complex and really a little challenging, sometimes more challenging than you'd even want. General population polls, because we know the population parameters, because of the census and others, and that they're not as time sensitive as a quick election poll, are more fun to do and often more rewarding.
So I don't want to get into methodologies too much. That's not exactly what we're interested in here. But since you mention it and thinking about knowing, the population, not having to think about likely voters, there's something that's been on my mind around polling. And I think that this would be true of both of the kinds of polls we mentioned. I just want to get your temperature on the sampling bias problem. Because even if we're thinking about polls of religious identity, or Gallup does belief in God or things like that, the people who are likely to pick up the phone or answer a poll or talk to a stranger, it seems like that really, would shift age-wise, for example, but might also shift, around one's ideology or one's perception of the world or one's perception of threat from the outside. How do you think this could skew our perceptions of even the general population, even if we're not having to think about people who may or may not vote?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. One of the methodological challenges for public opinion researchers, Chip. And first of all, it's not easy. It's not easy to get around some of those non-respondent issues that have challenged the field for years and years, and have only gotten more challenging with changes in communication. Everything you described is accurate. So first of all, it takes a lot of attention to those things, recognizing that those are potentials, and you could see it sometimes, especially if you have population parameters, right? So, for example, if I'm doing a general poll in Pennsylvania, and I know a certain segment of the population, by age or racial or ethnic identity is at a level, and we're underrepresenting that or overrepresenting that, we could do a couple of things. We could try a lot harder to go back and reach those populations, and sometimes we do. It takes a lot of money, takes a lot of time. Other times we'll try to account for that with statistical weighting, where we weight those percentages of the population to their, or the sample to their population parameters. That has risks involved with it, right? You're making assumptions based off the group, and maybe that group of young people that responded isn't representative of the broader young group. So there's lots of challenges with that. One of the things we get to do is sometimes validate. And this is where election polls come in handy, because there is an actual result that we could compare to see what we found. And if we are, in essence, kind of replicating what happens in reality or close to it, it gives us a sense that the measures we took to address some of those limitations are paying off. Doesn't mean it's perfect, and lots of polling breakdowns, if you will, over time, but it's a challenging area. And so we have to really adapt methodologically as researchers to account for those things. Sometimes we do it well, but the one constant is that those pressures are going to continue for quite some time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about something like race or ethnicity or age. Your number of respondents, and the number of people in the population more or less, and you can account for that. I always wonder about things like, is there some correlation between what people think about climate change and whether they're likely to respond to a poll or not, which would be impossible to get your hands on if there's a correlation in something like that.
It's very true. It's very true. When you don't have a population parameter, you're kind of making assumptions, right, based on some other things that you have a pretty good representative sample. But again, you don't have complete, confidence that that's the case.
So obviously, on Religion Wise, we're interested in the ways that religion and religious identity interact with other aspects of public and communal life. Can you give us a basic lay of the land for how pollsters think about religious identity, and the electorate or the general population, and what that's looked like over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, pertinent to our talk today and your work on Religion Wise, Chip. So first of all, pollsters regularly ask questions about individuals' religious identity. How they affiliate, what they believe, how they practice their religion, and so those questions are pretty common. As someone that's polled now for a quarter of a century, I'd say over 90% of the polls that I've conducted have at least one religious question item in it, and probably the most common is just, how do you identify? In a classic breakdown of options, from Catholic to Protestant to Jewish, to Muslim or none, which we'll talk about moving forward. And so we try to do that because it is predictive of lots of things that we're studying. What you believe, how you affiliate politically, what you are concerned about, and so measuring those things are pretty common. And most pollsters in general population surveys will have some type of religious question. The question often for us is, how many questions? depending on the content and what we're trying to measure, which is fascinating, right? So general identification is important, but probably as important is the level of practice or engagement with your religion. Do you go to mass or synagogue or services, right? How often do you do that? Tells us a whole bunch, especially when paired with your affiliation and how you identify. And so trying to get at that. And then kind of, for example, you mentioned climate change, and we do a national survey on climate change every year. And we want to ask some religious questions because it really is a fascinating relationship between religious factors and beliefs and opinions on climate change. So we ask a question generally, do you identify as whatever religion? And then we ask kind of a follow-up question that asks about your perception on the Bible, or, and so we say, hey, is it the actual Word of God? Is it the informed word of God that is interpreted, or is it a book of fables, right? And because that breakdown tells us a lot about kind of where individuals might be, and it's very predictive of a bunch of things that we look at. So, measuring religiosity, if you will, is a challenge, and it's interesting to think about the types of items that we might employ to do that. And it differs across polls and it differs across researchers. And of course, content area. If our focus was very deeply on religious issues, we'll have many more measures.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm interested and happy to hear about, thinking about the differences between belief, affiliation, practice, frequency. And it also occurs to me like the relationship between all of those things might be different depending on the religious tradition you're dealing with as well. Right? Like what kinds of religions or religious identities can be practiced individually versus communally, for example. Like there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, I think.
Yeah, there is, Chip, and it's also one of those challenges, right? Every survey I've done, it's always a matter of space, right? What questions could you fit in, and which ones? And they're inevitably questions I'd love to get in, right? That you have to leave on the cutting floor at the end because you have to prioritize, the breadth of types of demographics rather than the depth or the intensity. But I would love to have many more kind of items that are religiously affiliated, because often you'll find things that are just really telling based on that nuanced version that might get washed away with more aggregate or kind of broad measures that we employ.
So one of the things at the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding that we're really interested in is the breadth of religious expression. So our Worldviews program is not only dealing with major Christian organizations that have lots of people, but also thinking about smaller. We just interviewed someone from a pagan community, or the Sikh community is not very large in the Lehigh Valley, for example. But we want to think about those. But it seems to me for your work, thinking about the larger groups gives us a better handle on public opinion in general, right? So going into the sort of less populist types of religious identity would be, not counterproductive, but wouldn't you're not allowed to have that sort of nuance for the metrics that you're interested in. Does that sound about
Yeah,
right?
it does, and it's a little sad, right? Often, for example, when we do a national poll or a Pennsylvania poll or even a regional poll, we our religious distribution in our sample usually looks like the population, right? So if it's a predominantly Christian area, we're going to get predominantly Christian individuals in our sample, right? And that could be an overwhelming majority in some cases, leaving us with very small sample sizes for religious affiliations that are fairly small within the population, right? Often, as you just mentioned, individuals that might have a pagan identity, or often cases, even more traditional religious groups that we might think like individuals identifying as Jewish, right? In places we might just have, 20 people in our survey of 500 that identify in that group. And that really makes it hard to make any type of generalizations about those identities per se. And it really is often, what's sad is sometimes to get around that, we'll simply aggregate non-Christian groups into other religions, right? And as someone that studies religion, I'm sure that's just horrifying to think that you're, putting a group so disparate in their views and into just a category. But we do that mathematically just to compare, right? Christians versus non-Christians, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. One group that we often have are people that might describe themselves as not practicing a religion, atheist, agnostic, right? Sometimes we lump those into a group. And it does wash away so much of it, which leaves the kind of the big point, I think, Chip, is those groups you have to kind of target as a separate project, right? So if you want, I've done studies, for example, on Jewish Americans. That we find methodologies not always easy to really target a group specifically, get a big enough sample of that group to make better inferences than we could ever do with these broad population surveys where the sample sizes are just too small to make meaningful inferences.
So let's stick to a place then where I think you have more luck with getting a sample size big enough. And I'll tell you the narrative, at least when I teach my Christian traditions class, what that narrative looks like. The narrative that goes in my head around the last 50 years goes something like this: that evangelical and otherwise socially conservative Christian voters were not particularly active until the 1980 election cycle. Since that time, that voting bloc has become very powerful, first coming out for Ronald Reagan and then other Republican candidates predominantly. After that, there are a number of groups or a number of issues that group is particularly attentive to around reproductive health, definitions of marriage, roles of public education, etc. This has resulted also in realignment of the parties, even if we're thinking about realignment of the way that the country is imagined. The Democratic Southern South is no more, largely because of this trend. Does that sort of narrative about the way that this kind of socially conservative group of Christian voters has shifted, does that seem about right to you? Is it overly general? What do you think?
No, I think it's right, Chip. It was one of the defining features of American politics, certainly when we were layering religiosity into it. The emergence of evangelical voters as a defined and impactful voting bloc in the United States has been a cornerstone of politics since the 80s. And as you said accurately, it really rose in the 80s and in some ways was intensified moving forward, into this century, and often strategically. By the way, I'm sure that is how that happened. Didn't just happen, right? It was very much orchestrated and politically, thought about, and has had impacts through many cycles, including the most recent cycle. We could talk about that. But yeah, it's evangelical voters have since the 80s become a increasingly core part of the Republican coalition in the United States. It's changed, as you said, as you tied it into regional politics in the South. The South, which was historically the most democratic place in the country, dating back to the Civil War and its roots there. Largely white voters in the South were overwhelmingly Democrat. And also that overlaid with a area that was overwhelmingly Protestant, often evangelical, and that made a part, right? That made a part of the politics that were in place in the South, and that's changed dramatically over the last 40 years.
So here's a bit of my frustration, because I think that story that we've laid out, totally makes sense. We can plot it. We can look at results in presidential elections, in legislatures. We can see that. But I think the part where I get frustrated is when you look at sort of pundits thinking about politics, thinking about religious identity, that it stops there, right? And so you get a narrative of the ascendancy of and I will nuance it by saying a kind of Christianity or a kind of social conservatism. But on the other hand, there are lots of left-leaning progressive religious identities as well within Christianity and out. So mainline Protestantism has in recent years become a lot more progressive. We could think about the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America or the Episcopal Church, for example. Both have opened up to different kinds of identities, been more welcoming, particularly around LGBTQ, et cetera. And then we also have groups like African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, that maybe has been less progressive on sex and gender issues, but certainly is very progressive on pluralism around race and ethnicity, for reasons that make all kinds of sense. So can you think a little bit or help me think a little bit about that coalition on the left? Does it operate in the same way as the coalition on the right? Is it intentional in the same way as the coalition on the right? Because it seems to me like these, I mean, maybe they don't balance one another out, but they're both parts of the story of the confluence of politics and religious identity in the country. But yet I don't feel like they get the same airtime.
Yeah, it's a great observation, Chip, and really important. Yeah, there is so much focus on the evangelical presence within the GOP base and strategy and coalitions in terms of elections. But you're very accurate when you look, for example, at mainline Protestant Americans, people that identify with Lutheran Church, Methodist Church, Presbyterians. At one time, it was the bedrock of the Republican Party in many ways. Lots of northern suburban Americans that voted in elections voted overwhelmingly Republican with those identities, right? With those religious identities, and that's very much changed over time. And we see in recent elections, when we look at exit polls and studies of this, that mainline Protestant votes are pretty evenly distributed, and if leaning anyway, lean Democrat in most, especially in some high profile elections. And so you've seen that really change in terms of the coalition. Now, of course, one of the comparisons that you know well is in the size of those groups, as mainline Protestant groups have tended to decline in size versus evangelicals that have risen generally over that period. The impact is different, right, in terms of electoral politics, but nonetheless still salient. And then, as you mentioned, as we talk about Black voters and their religious identity, the presence of the Black church, right? If largely just broadly defined, has been incredibly pivotal in democratic politics, American politics, but in contemporary times, there is no group that is a more loyal supporter of the Democratic Party than Black voters. And among Black voters, the most loyal Democrats are often highly religious, affiliated with groups like you said, the AME groups and Southern Baptist groups that have long had a place in democratic politics, and even more so now. So the coalitions have changed; they've evolved. But certainly beyond evangelical Christians, the place of religion in American politics is much richer and deeper. Partisan politics too is all we're talking about at this point.
Mhm. Yeah, you think about the confluence of race and political activity. And so I'm thinking about the Souls to the Polls initiatives, right? Where you make sure that you have a movement that wants to get polling places open on Sundays so that you can compound church attendance, in some of these, particularly in the Black church, with getting out and going straight to the polling place.
Yeah, indeed. Those overlays are fascinating, right? And it brings in all kinds of interesting questions that we might entertain in an elections or politics class, right? Where are those divides? Where are they, legally allowed to go, which is a whole other variety. I'm sure great a show in itself for you, Chip. But yeah, there's connection points all over the place. That could be examined.
So harder, as we've mentioned before, harder to get our hands on, but I think important for us to recognize here is that religious identity in the American population is more than just thinking about Christianity. We could think about, Judaism, for example, Jewish identities with similar things, right? About some Jewish communities will lean very far left, some Jewish communities will lean very far right. So we could think, about whether we're talking about Orthodox or Reform or conservative or Reconstruction, right? We could do that whole thing as well. But then also the other big question that I think is maybe a puzzle that needs answering a little bit is for thinking about the future is about other religious identities in the country growing. You can think about Muslims and Hindus, for example, or even, to get back to another Christian identity, Latino Catholic voters as well. What can we say about increasing diversity of religious identity as the country as it relates to both public opinion and more specifically to the electorate?
Yeah, I mean, all those elements are key, even in the most recent cycle. Chip, as you kind of piece it, take it apart, and we're still doing that, looking at all the evidence and validation and exit polling and things. But you see, within groups and again the confluence, right? So if we look at the growing Hispanic Latino population in the United States, and we think about that as a voting bloc, if you will, one of the most contested now and coveted voting blocs. Where does religiosity overlay with that group? And it's fascinating, right? The group largely leans Democratic, as you look at. Although in this election, we saw, and especially in places like Florida, that lean go away. And there's diversity within the Latino and Hispanic community is very important. Cuban Americans versus Mexican or Puerto Rican individuals, really different. So we're washing away differences there, but also religious differences, as you talk about. Catholic versus evangelical Latinos, very different perspective, right? Religiously practicing Latino and Hispanics, very different than those that might be less engaged in their politics. And that's really where some of the strategy of contemporary elections have come in. Republicans have increasingly targeted Hispanic voters who are religious in their nature, say, is finding an opening that they think along cultural conservatism and those and beliefs that align more with perhaps traditional Republican views might be an ability to crack into a growing demographic through a religious and also cultural lens. And so you see these kind of places, as you mentioned, other groups that are growing, the broadly defined Asian American population, right, that often has a high level of people identifying as Muslim or Hindu, right, and how that might be channeled. And then there's a little bit of overlay on the conservatism issue and those types of things that make those groups that also vote generally Democratic, not monolithic in their nature, and as their size grows, and that is a growing population within the United States, I think attention will increasingly be paid to how both parties might lay strategic kind of claim to those populations, right? Through at least partially religiously identified markers.
Yeah, it's not hard to imagine an individual who, because it's a part of the tradition of their religious community, for example, is socially pretty conservative, right, around family issues, sex and gender issues, et cetera, but then also has a really expansive view of what civil rights should look like or what immigration policies should be, or something like that. And so they end up, one could imagine somebody like that being caught between the two parties or between the two platforms.
Oh, it totally, and that's all the groups we just discussed, but even among Black voters, you've seen that, right? You've seen attempts among Republicans to really leverage those connection points to try to persuade Black voters to vote Republican, and with a marginal degree of success. As we look at, and again, politics is probably my most overused cliche is about margins. It's won on the margins in places like Pennsylvania and others. And so if you can, even move a group 2 or 3 points, it's impactful, right? It's impactful. So we often, we look at these big pictures and say, oh, black voters overwhelmingly Democrat, and they are. But if it's overwhelmingly at 93% versus 90%, and it's a close election, okay, it's impactful.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Very good point. Absolutely. So one of the major trends, and you've alluded to this already, so I know it's something that I think probably impacts both of our work a little bit. But one of the major trends of the last 20 years or so, and we could sort of quibble over how long this has been happening. We might also say the last 50 years, has been the decline of self-identification with membership in a religious community or in a religious denomination. The number of those associated with this group, which we sometimes refer to as the nuns, Nones, not Nuns. Depending on the poll, depending on who you ask, I'd be interested to hear your number on this, is somewhere between 30 and 50%. Teaching at a college, I think we both are acutely aware of the trend and how it affects 18 to 22-year-olds. If we can look at our matriculation data and find this bearing out in the same way. What do you make of this trend? How does it affect electoral politics, views on social policy, party affiliation, et cetera? Has this trend, provided headaches for you?
I wouldn't call it a headache, but it's something that absolutely is significant in so many ways, both from a measurement perspective, and it's impactful in a lot of ways. And you're dead on, Chip. This is not only our research, but pollsters and public opinion researchers across the country have picked up on this. Trend, as you said, that date probably does, and it's really a good observation. Probably dates back farther than we've really started to identify it. A lot of it's kind of identified as a 21st century artifact, and at least the intensity of it has expanded. But there's inklings of this much farther back, right? And scholars that have looked at it, and public opinion researchers. But it's ballooned. So I've been polling for over a quarter of a century, mostly in Pennsylvania, and a little before that out in Wisconsin. And we always ask these religious marker questions, right? Even the identity questions. And so over hundreds and hundreds of surveys that I've done, every year you kind of look at, well, what percentage are identifying, at least, saying that they identify with religious groups. And as you said, the trend is absolutely moved to a greater portion of the population saying, I don't have a religious identity, the nuns, as you said, or that they are agnostic, in their kind of views. Those two are growing. It's interesting that atheism, as an option that we look at, has grown modestly over that time, but not at the same rate as the nun/agnostic. And I know I'm blending stuff together here, but at least from a polling perspective, those are the growth sectors of if you will, and it's dramatic. It's dramatic. Your number, about 30 to 50 in that range is where most polls put it. So if you look at our polls, and it changes, right? If we're looking at an electoral poll versus a general population poll, we might have a smaller percentage of nuns in an electoral poll than we would a general population poll because of voting patterns. But on average, over the last, handful of years, we're probably seeing 35 to 40% fall in those categories that are there. And then you could, it's actually interesting. As I said, it's hard to get inferences about small religious groups percentage-wise of the population, maybe Muslims, Hindus, Jews. That's not the case anymore for nuns. We have a big sample size. So we start to be able to really look at how they think, what they believe, how they act. And there's overlays with age, all the things you said, especially, with cohorts like college students, where this is the majority group, by the way. It is the majority. So just put that into kind of context. And that group's, ascending while other groups are not. And that doesn't guarantee anything. We could have a change culturally that might shift that. So I'm not a predictor of such things. But probabilistically, at least for the short term, they're going to be more impactful electorally. And they do lean Democratic. They also overwhelmingly lean, at least in their brand identification, as independent. They might vote more democratically in general, but they don't like to be called Democrats. They often want to be called independent, and that might be, they don't want to affiliate with a religion. They don't want to affiliate with a party either. So that kind of synergy, I think, is fascinating to look at.
Yeah, I would really want to drive that home, because one of the things I'm thinking about here is that um, just because to say somebody does not affiliate with a religious group doesn't necessarily mean, for example, I know Gallup has for years and years asked this question about belief in God, right? And the belief in God number doesn't drop nearly so quickly as the affiliation membership question. So the correlation I always point to is that if you go back a couple generations in my family, people were really involved in like the Lions Club and social lodges and things like that, which are almost, I mean, I don't want to offend anybody to say that they're irrelevant or they're gone, but there's certainly the membership in even our generation, or certainly younger than us, is much, much less. And it seems to me like those aren't religious organizations, but they're tracking something similar about membership and affiliation versus larger questions of values and meaning, meaning making, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and borne out by lots of statistics, right, about how we join and where we join and how we align with organizations in general, right? And the none, as you said, that does certainly, and this is why you need multiple measures, right? Someone that says they're not affiliated might be on beliefs very, more aligned with somebody that might be practicing, right? It's just, it gets complex. That's why multiple measures are very important to have. But that overlay that I think is fascinating, right, is that I don't consider myself, this group, that they might not consider themselves part of an organized religion. They might not consider themselves part of a organized party, and they might not consider themselves engaged with organized community groups, right? That doesn't, and by the way, that doesn't mean that they're not engaged in communities, right? They might volunteer, they might do things, but that's kind of on their time, under their agency.
Right. With no membership card necessarily.
No
Right.
card,
Right.
no
Right.
cards for any of these.
Actually, and I'll take host prerogative here just to share something that I think really, again, drives this point home. But, in some of my classes, we take field trips to local communities. And one of the things that I've started to learn to ask is membership numbers versus attendance. And if you go and you look at, say, mainline Protestant communities, their membership might be 500 and their attendance might be 100, right? So like 20% of people who are members will attend on a weekly basis. If you go to a evangelical community, their membership might be, and the community I'm thinking of is much larger, but say their membership might be 500 and their weekly attendance might be 2,000. Right. So it runs in the opposite direction, that the membership is a subset of attendance, whereas in mainline Protestantism, attendance is a subset of membership, which I think just speaks volumes about sort of the structure and organization, about the way that these groups see those two, those two constituencies.
Oh, that's fascinating. Really cool. And that's insightful, and I think it does kind of overlay with those broader trends that we saw, and also again speaks to the idea of how you measure
Mhm.
things, right? So if I asked to somebody, "Are you, formally affiliated with a religious institution?" And somehow I don't know if that's well worded, versus do you engage in religious practices, right, or service, it might be very different, right? And by the way, then you start getting into the joy of data analysis, right? Getting into those groups, like you said, finding someone that doesn't affiliate but goes regularly versus someone that is affiliated but never goes, and seeing how they align. So that's, as a geeky academic, I see nothing but cool research questions there.
Okay, so to get away a little bit from the elections and those sorts of issues, and to think more about public opinion more broadly, we've touched on a number of these issues already, but we might add, climate change, pandemic response, gender identity, those sorts of things as, issues that are, currently being polled, that people are currently interested in. As someone who conducts polls, how do you think about those sorts of issues as related to religious identity or religious community and, or religious practice? Like, we've problematized that enough already. But so we talk a lot about polarization around party, but it seems to me there's an older kind of polarization around these sort of social issues. How much are we seeing of this sort of being a self-sorting around social issues and rather than something new, right? We're just sort of seeing it in a different lens.
Yeah, no, it's a really cool question and framed nicely. Chip, it's, you think about these pathways, between party, religious identity, a whole series of demographics and how it might shapes one's support for policies, and then vice versa, how the policies and positions might shape your identity, right? That it's a great question that we ask, kind of causality within political science is like, okay, are your beliefs leading you to the policy, to the party? Is the party leaving you to the beliefs, your affiliation? And it's over time, it's a little dynamic, right? And I think there are some evidence right now, actually really interesting studies that I've read, that your party identification in this age of kind of negative partisanship that we live in is actually leading you to some of your religious viewpoints and affiliations. We're seeing this. I think this is like in the moment, like one of the cool research questions is that you have individuals that based on, where they stand politically right now, are making decisions about how they might practice, or if they're shopping for a church or a religious organization that aligns with them. That seems to be more common, at least by some metrics that I'm seeing, than it has been in the past, right? And rather than, you're kind of shaped, you start with your religion, you start with your other things, and that shapes your partisanship. So that by itself is fascinating. But then you get into the particulars of policy and issues that you looked at. So we've probably talked over the years, most of my kind of academic research is on climate change. And have followed that now for decades, doing lots and lots and lots of national and regional polls. And the religious overlays there always, I find, incredibly fascinating, right? You might not think on the surface, like, why would, religion and climate change would not the first, though. It's like, well, that's an easy comparison, right? Compared to religion and abortion, maybe, or something like that. But nonetheless, it's impactful, right? It's so impactful. I'll give you just a quick side story methodologically. So for years, we asked people open-ended questions. So if we asked them, do you think climate change is happening? And they said yes or no. Is there evidence of it? We'd ask them a follow-up question. Well, what's the biggest factor that leads you to conclude that there's evidence of climate change? And people would point to science or their own experiences for it. And we kind of coded those into categories. We had never thought when we created it that religious factors would appear regularly in those open-ended comments, both why you think it's happening and why you don't think it's happening. So people would tell us, what's the major reason? They'd say, well, the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
or that it's God's will, or something like that. And so we had to kind of adjust our whole methodologies to account for its presence in a place we didn't think it necessarily would be. And those are the things, like when we look at religion across a variety of subjects, that we might locate it and its impact in an array of factors that might not necessarily seem on first blush to be, a clear connection point.
So I love that story because it confirms one bias of mine, and I want to ask you about sort of polling and, if you can speak for the field generally. But the bias of mine is that very often religion is, or religious identity, religious belief, religious affiliation is very far down the list of the kinds of factors that people thinking about public opinion or just generally, studying human behavior, that it always seemed to me, and again, occupational hazard for me is that, hey, we all have, whether we are religiously affiliated or not, we all have a worldview, right? We all have a way in which we imagine the world working that is based on assumptions about who we are and how we grew up and the communities we're around, et cetera. And this story you tell is super interesting because you offer then the corrective of how you then incorporate that. do you think that in the field generally, I mean, obviously things like race and ethnicity and wealth, um, social placement, all get a lot of attention. Do you see religion getting? I don't know how to ask this. Getting the attention I think it deserves, right, in contemporary polling, or is this still like the eighth factor in other things that people imagine are motivating public opinion?
It's a really good question, and I think your position that it's probably pushed aside sometimes or overlooked, maybe is a better word, is true just from my own experience. And I speak, from writing lots and lots of surveys. And so imagine this: you're writing a survey, and you have limited number of questions, and you have so many substantive questions, so many demographic questions. And I've been in this place, and I have to admit it, sometimes where I have to cut demographics. And so, so if it's age, race, income, educational attainment, gender, that's a variety of ones, and religion, religious affiliation, whatever one we're using, which one gets cut? And I have to say that more often than not, compared to those other ones, it would be the religion question.
Mm-hmm.
It would be like, well, I don't see any, as I said, maybe erroneously, well, I don't see any logical connection why this should affect, someone's position on this. And it's probably captured with some of the other partisan things that we have. So on the cutting floor, maybe that religion question gets dropped and we're missing things, right? The climate example is a perfect example. I just didn't see it. And my co-author, which was fascinating, his wife is a Lutheran minister. And she kind of said, well, why didn't you see that? I remember talking, oh, well, because we didn't. And it's like we found, and then we corrected, as she said, we did. And now we asked more questions, more religion questions in our demographic one, because we found it so fascinating and so impactful. So I think your assumption is probably borne out, at least from my case of many, many years of doing this.
So, and again, I know that my perspective is very limited on the work that you do, right? I see it as a consumer of polls and polling data, and from talking to you and other people in the field, but I don't have obviously the insider's view on all this. So, with that being said, what am I missing? Like, what is the really important thing that I might not be able to see from my perspective about what public opinion research looks like, how it thinks about some of these issues? Like, where's my blind spot here?
Yeah, I don't know if you have a big blind spot, Chip. From at least our last 45 minutes of discussion, you seem to have a pretty good feel for it. Maybe where we started takes us back to the challenges, right? It is a really challenging time. I've been doing this for over a quarter of a century. And I look back at when I started and I said, boy, that was at least relatively easy to do. It's harder now. It takes a lot more time, it takes a lot more money to do it right. So there's more challenges. There's also some more opportunities to be able to field studies and reach people through online platforms and other things that are opening up, and we're exploring all of those at the Institute for our next stage for however long we roll. And I think it's just being attentive. The thing I say to consumers of public opinion research is be attentive to the methods and the track record of the organizations you look at. There's a kind of proliferation of people that say they're doing polling or public opinion research, and that sometimes new folks are doing it great, and other times I have some questions about their transparency and what they're doing and how they're arriving at their conclusions. And so be good consumers, like you are of anything else, of the type of data that you receive that measures what the public thinks and believes.
All right. Well, I think that is a great place to wrap it up. Thank you very much for appearing on Religion Wise. We really appreciate your perspective on this.
It was such a pleasure. Chip, thanks for having me aboard. It's a great honor.
This has been Religion Wise, a podcast produced by the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding of Muhlenberg College. ReligionWise is produced and directed by Christine Flicker. For more information about additional programming, or to make an inquiry about a speaking engagement, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you'll find our contact information, links to other programming, and have the opportunity to support the work of the Institute. Please subscribe to ReligionWise wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.